This is Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball discussion, hosted by Inside the Hall founder and editor, Alex Bozich. Since 2007, Inside the Hall has been trusted by IU fans across the globe to be the one-stop shop for IU basketball news, commentary, and analysis. Join us over at InsideTheHall.com. That's InsideTheHall.com.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. And I'm pleased to be joined this week by a good friend of the show, one of the web's best, in my opinion, the best bracketologist, Andy Bottoms. He's also a founding member of the Assembly Call, which hosts a post-game show for every IU game. I would say last week, Andy, you guys had kind of the polar opposites in terms of post-game shows. You had the win at Iowa, which was arguably Archie Miller's best win as IU's head coach, followed by Sunday's dud against Rutgers. But welcome back to Podcast on the Brink, Andy. Happy to have you with us.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, it was the best of times. It was the worst of times with hosting the show. Throw the Purdue game on before the Iowa one, and much like not knowing what you can expect from the team, we never really know what we're going to end up having to talk about and what the general tone is going to be of the show. So I guess we should be used to it at this point, unfortunately.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of different things I want to cover with you. Some about the team, some about bracketology, but we'll start with the bracketology stuff because you published this week your second. This is your second bracket you've done, right, this year?
Yep.
Second full bracket. It's been a little bit different for bracketology this season with the changes to the season, the pandemic. Typically before the season, Andy does a pretty comprehensive breakdown of teams and all that. And just with all the uncertainty this year, it was I don't necessarily think that was probably the best thing to do because we didn't know what was going to happen. So, he did, I believe, do a kind of a roundup type thing and an early bracket. And then now he's going to start with the weekly brackets on Tuesdays, I think, until Selection Sunday. I believe usually the last week of the season, he ramps it up and does one every day. But what's it been like so far trying to figure this out? Because in many ways, previous seasons, you had kind of precedent and different kind of things to look at and go by. And this year, you don't have that because you have a very little in terms of non-conference schedules, and you have all these games being postponed, canceled, and moved. And so I'm sure it's challenging. What are you trying to prioritize the most as you navigate this, and what is, I guess, the biggest challenge so far that you've encountered when putting these out?
Yeah, it's been an odd year. I think to your point, it was odd to start with, and it hasn't really gotten easier. I wrote in the intro to today's bracket that I'm curious as to whether the selection committee will do, I think it's 2 years they've done this, at least two, where they do the reveal at some point of the basically the top four seed lines. And I look back last year, it was February 8th. So if they're going to do it, presumably it would be fairly soon. And I'm curious to see whether that would give any insight. I don't know that it really would because there's not a ton of intrigue, at least on the first couple seed lines at this point. Villanova had a fairly long pause. Michigan looks like they may be heading into one. But I think it's those kinds of things that have been the most difficult, where you're trying to assess, do you penalize a team because they haven't played in 2 weeks, or Villanova, didn't play for the better part of a month, but they had a reasonable sample of games that I felt like you could evaluate them off of. And so tried to do that. But I know that in just kind of scanning through what other people have done, they said, well, they might teams could get leapfrogged by somebody because they just haven't played. And I don't know whether that's fair or not from really any standpoint of what you do with that. And the other thing that I think gets tricky, and again, we don't really have a great way to know how the committee will handle this, but usually there's such an emphasis placed on non-conference strength of schedule. We can talk about whether we think that makes sense or it doesn't. But this year, you're putting yourself essentially in a place where you're trying to understand what the intent was, because the intent might not have been what they actually were able to play for a variety of reasons and things like that. So can you penalize somebody because they had to go on pause and then they were just trying to get games with whoever they could get games with? Because I know Baylor their non-conference schedule isn't that great. They just started picking up games against whoever they could once they were able to get things started back up. But they were trying to play Gonzaga and do some of those things. So looking at that, and I guess I'll throw in one more at the end, is just road wins. That has often been I don't want to say a tiebreaker, but it's often been something that's gotten a lot of weight from the committee. And while I think everybody would agree that it's still different playing from home, just from a routine standpoint and all those kinds of things, not winning a game, winning a road game where the other team's fans aren't there, does that take on less weight? Do they weigh those things differently? So I think it's just a lot of unknowns, and then you're going to have more unbalanced schedules than you usually do, because some of these leagues, it just seems impossible that they're going to be able to make up the games that different teams have had to cancel. How will they handle that? The whole conference tournament thing. There's just a lot of stuff that's going to change between now and the 6+ weeks before Selection Sunday that the committee is going to have to deal with. And as someone who tries to predict what they're going to do, I'm going to have to deal with it as well. Yeah,
I mean, you mentioned making up games, and we're already seeing with the Big Ten this week that we're in right now was supposed to be this flexible bye, collapsible bye, whatever week where they were going to make up some games. And you look at what's happening. There's Indiana's in a situation now where they're not playing for 8 days, so there's nothing being made up this week. It's because so many other different things have already had to shift around, and right now Indiana has lost 2 games. Well, as after this weekend, they will have lost 2 games, and I just don't know. I agree with you. I don't know where they're going to find the time to make all this up, particularly if there's going to be other pauses, because right now in the Big Ten specifically, we've seen Penn State impacted. We've seen Nebraska. We've seen Michigan State, Michigan. I'm trying to think if there's anybody else off the top of my head. But once you start getting multiple programs paused or missing games, then it becomes difficult to try to figure everything out. So, I think the priority is just going to have to be on not necessarily how many games a team played, but more how they performed, who they played, and what the result was. There's going to be no fair way to do this in general, because not all opportunities are going to be the same across all leagues. And the other thing I'll say about kind of the road wins is there are venues in college basketball right now that are having fans in some capacity. So when Indiana went to play at Florida State, there was 3,000, 3,500 people or whatever it was. You can make of that what you will, but that's, I think, different than playing a road game in the Big Ten right now, where it's basically a completely sterile environment where you just have friends and family. I want to get into the Big Ten because it's interesting to me that you have 11 teams right now in the field. Don't disagree with it, but you do make the caveat, I think you made it last week and made it this week, that that's unlikely to continue just based on the fact that these teams are going to continue to beat each other up, and some, I think, at the bottom are going to have a hard time kind of hanging on for dear life, so to speak, and keep their bid. Of the teams that you currently have in right now, who do you think is on the shakiest ground? And if you're forecasting it into the future, what do you think is actually a realistic number of Big Ten teams that could get in?
The team that was the last one in this week was Michigan State. So I guess inherently they're on the shakiest ground. Maryland was also in my last 4. Their resume is super odd because they have 3 really good road wins. Kind of go back to our road win conversation. They've won at Wisconsin, they've won at Illinois, they've won at Minnesota, and yet they've struggled at home. They've played a really tough Big Ten schedule so far, and so that doesn't look to ease up a ton for them as the season goes on. But at least they've got some quality wins to hang their hat on. If they can find ways to win a few more and get close enough to 500. Feels like those road wins have a chance at least to carry the day for them. Michigan State, on the flip side of that, just hasn't beaten anybody yet. And they're on a pause right now. And they're one of the teams, again, when we think about what that's going to look like and what the impact of that is and how the committee views that, they're only 2 quad 1 and quad 2 wins. They beat Purdue at home, or they beat Rutgers at home, pretty handily. And then they won at Duke, who also hasn't really accomplished anything at this point. They beat Notre Dame at home as well. They just don't have the good wins. And I think maybe even when I put them in this week and giving them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt of where they sit, because in terms of actual like resume quality, it's not there. And you could make an argument based on how they've played. You're probably fooling yourself into thinking that they're going to go win a ton of these other games as they start playing better teams in the league and continue down the league schedule. So I think they feel the shakiest just in terms of they have the least on their resume at this point, but perhaps the factor of having Tom Izzo as the coach helps to balance that out a little bit as they move forward. But I think those two feel like the shakiest at this point, with IU probably third in that group of teams that's closest to the cut line. I think to answer the second question you had, 10 feels a bit more realistic to me. I think you're going to have one of those teams fall out of it, but I would say as you look around other leagues, it's starting to become relatively clear who are legitimate contenders. And there's the kind of middle tier of some of the other major leagues that is not very good. The Big 12's got 7 pretty solidly in, I would say, at this point, and I don't know that changes, but using the ACC as an example, you've got Virginia, Florida State, Louisville, I think is safe at this point. Virginia Tech would be in that category. North Carolina, maybe. But then you've got Pitt, Georgia Tech, Duke, Syracuse. Clemson's had some struggles lately, but they're probably okay. So, if they've got 6, how many more realistically of Pitt, Georgia Tech, Duke, Syracuse can really get in? Maybe NC State's in that mix, but there's just not nearly as many quality wins to get in that league. And I think that plays a factor. The Pac-12 is the same way. They've had some really weird results. So outside of UCLA, USC, even Colorado has taken a bad loss lately, in Oregon. Maybe Stanford sneaks in. But I just think when you think about the proportion of bids that's usually taken up by the major conferences, there's some of them that probably aren't going to be able to foot the bill for that. Even the American, Houston feels like the only team that would get in at this point. And then mid-majors, go back to the scheduling stuff. It feels like a year where maybe you give more of those guys a break, but they probably had fewer opportunities to actually play better games. So it almost exaggerates the issues that we normally see and talk about with those kinds of teams before. So you got to get to 68 somewhere. You've got an extra auto bid with the Ivy League out there. So I feel like 10 seems pretty reasonable unless a couple teams just, really fall off a cliff and there creates some separation. But right now, the middle of the league and the ones that are closest to the cut line are just kind of beating up on each other, and we'll see how that plays out as the season goes forward. But I'd say 10 if you press me right now.
Hey, it's Jared. I'm going to jump in here real quick to talk about Home Field Apparel, our friends at homefieldapparel.com. And there are several reasons why you need to go to homefieldapparel.com to upgrade your Indiana University sports wardrobe. Number one, all of their materials are so comfortable. I have the hoodies. I have a crew neck sweatshirt. I just received my LEO t-shirt that they have, and all of the materials are so soft. It feels so good against your body. And what's nice is that they still feel soft even after you wash them, because a lot of materials, you get them, you wash them, they don't feel as nice. Home Field Apparel stuff really does, so you can count on that. Plus, they have logos there that you're not going to find anywhere else. That's kind of their thing. They have over 90 different schools that they work with now. They go and find these old brand marks and logos and mascots that haven't been used in 40, 50 years, sometimes longer, and they bring them back. And so it's this great way to indulge your love of nostalgia, find these old logos that you haven't seen. And so when you go there, you'll be able to browse. I mean, for Indiana stuff, they have 2 pages worth of gear that you can see, stuff on t-shirts, stuff on crew necks, stuff on sweaters, such comfortable stuff. And it's not just IU. You may have people in your life that went to school somewhere else. Sorry for those folks, but they may have. And you can find so much gear for other schools as well. And even better, you can save when you go there, because our promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, will help you save 20% on your entire order. So go to homefieldapparel.com, use that promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, and get 20% off your entire order. All right, back to the show.
Looking at Indiana's resume specifically, they've got 6 wins over top 100 teams in KenPom. I don't know necessarily how much weight a win over Providence is going to hold. Providence is a team right now that doesn't look like they're going to make the tournament, or at least as of right now, they're not going to make it. The Penn State home win is, a top 50 KenPom win, but I mean, Penn State right now realistically is not a tournament team. So you're looking at it realistically, their best wins are Stanford on a neutral court. Stanford you have in the field right now. At Iowa obviously is a big one, and then Maryland at home. So Stanford and Maryland are kind of closer to the cut line than they are actually being solidly in the tournament. And then obviously the Iowa win. Looking back at kind of what Indiana did with its non-conference schedule, I keep coming back to those two games that they scheduled, Tennessee Tech and North Alabama. Would they have done a better job, do you think, constructing this non-conference schedule by maybe not playing those two games and replacing it with something a little bit less bottom of the barrel? And in general, just kind of the rest of the way here, really, I guess the only opportunity for them to pick up a quote-unquote bad loss would be Northwestern, because that's one game they've already lost. I don't think they want to get swept by Northwestern. But what do they really need to do here the rest of the way to give themselves a good chance to make it in?
Scheduling wise, I guess even in retrospect, I don't know that I had a huge issue with it. I think with a young team, you probably had to schedule at least one of those low tier games because they were locked into Maui/Asheville, because they were locked into the Crossroads, because they were locked into the Big Ten ACC. Your wiggle room at that point is fairly small, and it looks like, at least the number that I'm looking at here says their non-conference strength of schedule ended up 58th. So I think they still didn't shoot themselves in the foot too terribly much. I think with Tennessee Tech, you probably wanted to get a game under your belt before you went to Maui, and you just took who you could get that you thought you could get out there, play somebody else, and get a little bit of confidence. So I didn't necessarily have a huge issue with that. I don't think it's going to come back and bite him. Those two games are really the only ones in quad 4 and the only ones that even can be in quad 4 based on what I'm looking at now. I guess theoretically Nebraska, we don't play Nebraska at home, so forget that. But if you played Nebraska at home, that would fall in that category. So, to end the season with 2 games in quad 4 and the majority of the games are going to end up in the first 2 quadrants, I feel like I didn't have a huge issue with that. I think what they ended up with, not necessarily by design, is a lot of middling teams that they ended up playing. I don't think anybody had super high hopes for Butler, but you probably figured they'd be a top 100 team in the net. They're not right now. They're 122nd. Stanford, I think, is maybe a little bit worse than people thought they were, but they're at least in the tournament field. And if you find yourself in a situation on the bubble, perhaps that game gives you a little bit of a boost there. Providence, I never really count out in the Big East. They're kind of in the mix, maybe a little bit more of a next 4 out, maybe slightly beyond that kind of team, but they're at least in the mix. But you just didn't have, outside of traveling to Florida State and then playing Texas, like those were really the marquee ones that ended up there, even though I don't necessarily think IU did a terrible job of scheduling, and they acquitted themselves well in one of those games at Florida State and not so well in the other one. And, the game like the Florida State games becomes an interesting one for the eye test and the thoughts around, well, does the committee have to rely on that more this year because there's fewer games and things like that? IU played really well on the road against the Florida State team that has really picked it up lately in the ACC and is going to be one of the top couple of teams in that league. You lose with that game by 2 in overtime, and as IU fans, we look at that and say that's a game they could have won, and they've squandered some of these opportunities that would have really boosted them a little bit more. But to the extent that anybody cares about the eye test, maybe that helps. To the second part of your question, in terms of what they need to do, you'd like to get, and it makes it hard because you don't know how many Big Ten games they're going to play, but let's look at what's actually scheduled out there now once you take the Michigan game away. So there's 9 games left, I think, as I'm looking at this. I think if you can find a way to go 5-4 and end up 9-9 in the Big Ten, I think you'd feel pretty good about your chances, and you probably could make an argument even at 8-10. You might be okay if you mirrored what you did in the first part of the season at 4-5. As you said, even the Northwestern game, based on where they are right now, would still be it's a quad 1 game, actually. Even though you might not think that. They're 71st, I believe, or they're 76th. Oh, I take it back. That'd be a quad 2, but they're right on the brink. So quad 1 is road games up to 75. So yeah, you don't have any games that are going to fall outside of the top couple quadrants. So every win helps you. Every loss, you don't want to say doesn't hurt you, because eventually the total number of losses actually matters. But that's one case where the Big Ten's put itself in a pretty good position of, if you can be steady around 500, you're probably going to be in great shape in the league, because you won't necessarily have taken a bad loss, and you're going to have picked up a number of quality wins. And that gets into a whole separate argument of how things are weighted more towards bigger conferences and things like that we don't necessarily need to get into. But it's when those kinds of discussions come up. So I think playing close to 500 ball the rest of the way would make him feel pretty safe.
So I'm already thinking into the future about the discussions that are going to be happening like 6 weeks from now, and I can already see the national media. Let's say Indiana does go something like 500 the rest of the way. Let's say there's something like 13-12 on Selection Sunday. I can already see the conversation is going to be, why does this team deserve to be in over, say, a mid-major team that's got a lot more wins but hasn't played the schedule? And I can just see Indiana kind of being the poster child for a team that had all these chances to win really good games, and they won a few of them, but for the most part, they lost a lot of them too. So do you foresee that being a conversation with some of these Big Ten teams who are going to obviously have some good wins just based on the fact that pretty much every game in the Big Ten that you play is good besides Nebraska? And I just feel like in a unique season like this, there's going to be a lot of noise about letting these teams in from these power conferences that have so many losses and not giving, quote unquote, the little guy a chance.
Oh, I have no doubt that at some point those questions are going to come up, and probably based on what we've seen in the past, rightfully so. And I think IU will be, and any Big Ten team for that matter, will be somewhat of an easy target for that kind of thing. I think a few things probably matter when we get to that point. One, it's what's happened with conference tournaments, and more specifically, what have some of these smaller conferences done with their conference tournaments. So I'll use Winthrop as the example. So they're 54th in the net right now. They're 15-0. 12 of their games fall in quad four just based on the league that they play in. They've been fairly dominant, but outside of beating Furman, they don't have a win in the top two quadrants. There's certainly an argument to be made that they're a really good basketball team. I think they're rated fairly high on KenPom as well. If the Big South goes and says, hey, we're just going to, are they saying we don't trust it? Our best chance to put our best team in the NCAA tournament is to give Winthrop the auto bid. Now they got to turn down the TV money. They got to do all those things and make those decisions, which I think some of these leagues will really struggle to do. But depending upon what happens there, you take out the notion that, they get knocked out in the semifinals and then you get these debates on whether those teams get in or not. And so I think those kinds of things matter a lot in those scenarios. I think the challenge for some of these other teams is going to be those other mid-major teams is who were you actually able to play? Were you able to prove that you could beat major conference teams? And I think that gets a little bit tricky, like I talked about earlier from a scheduling standpoint. Wright State's up pretty high, but they've got 2 quad 4 losses already. So you didn't really play anybody great, but you also lost to a couple bad teams, which is kind of a numbers game at some point. Toledo might be an interesting one as well. They're one of the better mid-majors. But again,
what about Loyola is another one that I'm looking at. They're 21 in KenPom. They're 13-3. But you look at their schedule, they haven't really beaten anybody. And right now, I think Drake's in position to win that league, right?
Yeah, they're still undefeated. They've been on pause for a while. And the series, and that's the other thing with some of these leagues, and the Missouri Valley has done this, the Mountain West has done this. They're playing these 2-game series where you still play the same number of league games, but you, depending upon the luck of the draw, you may get to play the other good teams at home, or versus you may get to play them on the road. And I know the Mountain West had like 3 teams among the last 4 in, first 4 out. And some of those you'd clearly seen teams that benefited from, hey, they got to host 2 of the better teams in the league. They went 3 in one of those games. Like, is that good enough? So you have these odd scheduling quirks. But yeah, Loyola is another one. That's a good example. And I know I had them in my, kind of next, I think I put 6 out this week. They had a pause, I believe, at a certain point in the beginning of the season, and 2 best teams they played, the 2 teams they played, they're in the top 90 of the net they lost to. One was to Wisconsin by 14 points, which I don't think there's a lot of shame in. The other one was by 2 on a neutral court to Richmond, which isn't bad either. But again, what gets held over these teams' heads a lot of times is you didn't beat anybody good. You didn't prove that you could do that. But if Loyola runs the rest of the way through the Missouri Valley, based on where Drake is, that'll give them a couple quad 1 wins. I think they play at Drake in that series. I was looking at that earlier, but I think they would be an interesting one. And I think if they really racked up a ton of wins in the league, probably makes sense to give the nod to a team like that, who consistently showed they weren't getting beat by bad teams and didn't have slip ups. There's something to be said for that as well. So it's going to be a weird year for that, because I just think fewer of those kinds of teams got opportunities. And even the ones that didn't really pick up quality wins that they can hang over the heads of, some of the other major conference teams. So I think they'd have to have like really gaudy records to do that. And again, it goes back to how the conferences handle their tournaments and how they hand out the auto bid and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think Loyola will definitely be one that we hear a lot about, simply because they were a story, in the not too distant past. They were kind of a national media darling. And I mean, I think they're, a solid, good program. The fact that their Ken Palm number is as high as it is, I think that'll also kind of give a little bit of the fuel to the discussion. So that would be interesting to follow. I want to shift now to kind of into this team, and as someone who talks about IU basketball a couple of times a week on the assembly call, on the radio show, you interact with fans on Twitter. You guys, I know, have a chat every game, or during the post game show and on assembly call radio where fans are interacting. I'm just kind of curious and I kind of know what my experience has been recently on Twitter and on the forum and going back and forth with fans and different things. But have you seen any noticeable shift kind of in the perception of the job that Archie Miller's doing this season from the fan base? And do you feel like we're reaching a point where fans are really getting frustrated at kind of the inconsistencies and the lack of, this past week's a perfect example of, you go and beat a really great team on the road and then you come home and you can't beat Rutgers. I think that's something that is beginning to wear on the fan base. I'm just curious kind of what your experience is and how you kind of gauge the temperature right now of the fan base and kind of what they're thinking.
Yeah, it fluctuates a little bit from game to game. I think what I'm starting to see, and I probably read the chat less during our shows than some of the other guys do, because I'm trying not to screw anything up if I'm hosting. But I think people are very much picking sides at this point. I don't think, where even coming into this year, you might have had some people that were in the middle, like, I'm not sure this is a big prove it year for him. I think you're seeing people definitely start to pick sides, and I think probably more, I would imagine you're nodding your head, so I'm assuming your experience is the same. There's more picking all right, I'm out on this guy at this point. Because even like during the games, I mean, I tend to just tweet stuff out about, if I'm charting possessions or this happened or that happened, stuff that's very like analytically based and just kind of like statistical facts. And then the responses to those have, it's just saying, hey, your fact just confirmed that I think this guy's terrible, or this team can't figure it out, or whatever else. And I don't necessarily blame people for that, because I think one of the things that everybody soured on during the Tom Crean era, among others, was the inconsistency of the team and the fact that you didn't know what you were going to get game to game, and the roller coaster like nature of what you would do. And I don't know how many times toward the end of the Crean era, we would have a show and we would talk about, well, I don't really know what to make of this game. I need to go see how they back it up, whether that was good or bad. And I think we find ourselves saying the same things now. And even after the Iowa game, as exciting as it was to win and to be really proud of how the team played and rallied together during a key stretch and battled through foul trouble, all those kinds of things, I think all of us on the show, and I think fans in large part, were content to just keep this team at arm's length, because you're trying not to get burned and get too high with, hey, maybe they've turned the corner, when very few things that you've seen over the last few years would suggest that there's a sustained turning of the corner. And that kind of, played itself out on Sunday against Rutgers, where it just wasn't a good performance. And even in spite of not playing very well, got themselves close enough to be in the game, but just not having enough guys where night in, night out, what you're going to expect. And consequently, as a team, not knowing night in, night out what you can expect and what this team can really hang its hat on, I think is becoming frustrating for a lot of people. And as good of a distraction or whatever you want to call it as it is to have the games back, I think people have, very much sunk back into the, like, this is just frustrating to watch, and this is not what I want Indiana basketball to be for the most part. I don't know if you'd echo that with what you're saying as well.
I mean, I have a text thread that Jared's on with my dad, and we kind of go back and forth during games a little bit and after games and just kind of different observations. And the thing, the things that stand out to me overall right now that I think that are holding things back the most, some of them are Archie related, some of them are not. I'll start with just kind of generally speaking, when I look at this roster, there's 11 scholarship players. One of them is out. There's 12 actually, if you throw in Parker Stewart now, but he's not really a factor at this point. So there was 11 to start the season. There was, and then Joey Brunk gets hurt. Look at the front court situation. Trayce Jackson-Davis is really good, but there's not a lot of help beyond that. Race Thompson, I think, has made strides as a pretty good player, but if you're a really good top half Big Ten team, look at some of the other rosters. Would Race Thompson be starting and playing a ton of minutes on those teams? I don't know. I would tend to lean probably, if you're, a top 15, top 10 team, he's probably a guy coming off your bench. So the depth in the front court, I think, is thin. And then I really look at the backcourt situation. Armond Franklin was an unexpected surprise early in the season, and now that he's gotten hurt, it's kind of put a lot of more pressure on Rob Finney and Al Durham. And when they play really good, Indiana's really good, right? When at Iowa, those two guys played great, and Indiana got a great win. And then the other day against Rutgers, both of them didn't play very well, and we see kind of the result was Indiana not playing well. And those two are upperclassmen now, and I think that just the inconsistencies that they're showing is a major problem because there's not a whole lot of options behind them. In terms of Archie, I think the numbers in terms of how he's improved the defense overall, you look at Ken Palm, he's obviously made it better over the years. But the lack of consistency in terms of things like free throw shooting, 3-point shooting, turnovers, like the other night coming out in the second half and having 5 turnovers in 2 minutes, that's the kind of stuff that really drives people nuts when they're watching the game. Because to me, the most basic parts of basketball are take care of the ball, defend, and be able to shoot. And Indiana hasn't been able to shoot now really reliably for 4 years. The other night, Archie made the comment in the post game. I asked him about the 2-point shooting. He said, well, people say we can't shoot, but we made 10 of 16 threes. Well, they also only made 35% of their twos. So if it's not one thing, it's the other. And so I just think in general, I agree with what you said. It's kind of turning into a similar situation where it was with Crean, in that people are definitely digging into kind of their side of things. I would encourage people as best they can to kind of let the season play out and see how it ends before kind of forming a final opinion. But I feel like there's a lot of people now who are already kind of reached their conclusion of what they think this is, and they may very well be right. But right at this point in time, nothing's going to happen in terms of who the coach is this season. And so I think the kind of just let it play out and see what happens. The season's very much still kind of in the balance. We'll see how it ends. But, I understand the frustration. And ultimately, I think if Archie's not able to kind of establish a baseline for his program, at least, being able to get into the tournament every year and giving themselves a chance to advance, I just think it's going to be very hard for any, not just him, but for any coach with the expectations of Indiana fans to kind of be viewed as a success.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. Even last year, I had him in when the season got shut down. I think most people did as well. And I think they would have made it, but they wouldn't have made it comfortably. And they're not in position to make it comfortably now. So again, this kind of steady, slow progression is not really getting people where they want. And I think it's reasonable then for people to kind of spin that forward and say, well, what does next year look like? And that points back to roster construction and some of those things that I think are plaguing this year's team a bit. You're having to count. Your point on the guards is exactly right. Those guys have to play well. There aren't really other options, at least based on the way guys have been used. And you also put yourself in a position where you really had to count on some combination of these freshmen to be able to come in and play major minutes because you didn't have any other options. And yes, the Joey Brunk injury was not expected, and that caused a little bit of it. But at the very least in the backcourt, maybe you could sit back and say, hey, as the coach, I knew Armond Franklin was going to make this jump. I don't think anybody else expected it. It's been without question one of the more positive parts of the season, and really excited for his future and the strides that he made, and the fact that he stands out because he's one of the guys who's more aggressive. And I talked about this after the show the other day. Sometimes it's to a fault, but there's too often times that other guards are just going to dribble side to side and not really probe the defense, not really put pressure on the defense. And he's a guy who's going to do that, whether you like it or not in some cases. But I think that's been a good development. But you look at this team, if Trayce leaves, you lose Al, what does this team look like? Is it appreciably better? Your front court issues are even more pronounced if that scenario plays itself out next year that you had. And so there's still recruiting to be done and transfers and all those kinds of things. But it's also, you're trying to look and see the projection of how the team is set up in the future. And that part is scary as well. And just back to your defensive comments, again, for a team that I think statistically has shown that progress, there's still these lapses in games that are both brilliant, as it was at times in the Iowa game. And, Jordan Sperber had, some of the clips out of just how well and they were doing everything you want to see from a pack line defense. And then against Rutgers, you've got a team that's coming in reeling. They played a really good first defensive possession and then let them score on 6 straight with putting up very little resistance, with most of the shots at the rim or wide open threes. It's just, I think that's the consistency. And at some point, you got to put that on everybody. I don't think that's only coaching. And you got to put that a little bit on the leadership of the team and guys not relaxing in scenarios where they do. But it all comes home, the one loss record all comes home to roost with him at some point. And I think that's where people, to what you said, are starting to pick sides. And I think at this point, I think you're right. Let's see how the season plays out. Can they get to some sustained momentum? And then we can have the questions about what the team actually looks like next year and what that is. But it's, you look at it and it's hard to, you look at a team that's won a game, lost a game for, how many games in a row now. It's kind of who they are. And until a stretch proves otherwise, I think that's what most fans are going to believe, that they're going to be inconsistent, and people just find that frustrating and tough to deal with.
How much better do you think Trayce is this year than last year? The discussion to me about, it feels like most people feel it's a foregone conclusion that he's leaving. I look at draft boards and I'm not seeing him anywhere in the first round. If he's anywhere, he's late second. I don't think the ESPN, that's the one I look at the most. Jonathan Cavone, I think, does a really good job. The former Draft Express guy that now works for ESPN, he doesn't have him being picked. And I feel like there's this assumption that he's leaving. I look at his game and I say he's definitely better this year, but his usage rate is also a lot higher, so he's getting a lot more opportunities. So that kind of goes along with, his stats being better, and they're obviously emphasizing him more. But I still look at some aspects of his game. He's not a great rebounder, I don't think. I mean, he's a good rebounder, but he's not like an elite rebounder. He doesn't seem to have a right hand around the basket in terms of how he finishes. And his free throw shootings, Stephen Bardo, I think, he didn't mention specifically on the broadcast the other day, but he said these guys talking about going to the NBA and they can't even make a free throw. And I think he was in some ways talking about Trayce. So I'm just kind of curious if you buy into that whole thing that it's a foregone conclusion that he's leaving to go to the NBA, because I just don't necessarily know what his role would be right now based on the type of player he is. I just don't see a huge market for that. And do you think he's actually gotten a lot better, or do you think it's more of more of just him getting emphasized more? Because I do think he's improved. I'm not saying he hasn't improved, but I just don't necessarily see like a guy who's ready to go to the NBA and be on a team at this point.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think he has improved. I think his passing has gotten better. I think he's gotten a little bit more comfortable in some situations where he needs to handle the ball. There was a play he made where he was dribbling out around the foul line or the top of the key, gets Miles, I think it was Miles Johnson, to kind of lunge one way and crossed over, got around him, got to the basket, got fouled for one of his shots. So I think he's improved some of the skills, but I would also say if you looked at the list of things that he probably got in terms of feedback last year, I don't know that you'd go down that list and check a whole bunch off and say, hey, this is something he's corrected. And that's kind of how I look at it. And that's ultimately why I think some people talk about it as a foregone conclusion. I think a minute ago I said if. I've been trying to say if more because I don't necessarily, I say this without knowing anything about where his mindset is, but just in terms of like what you would look at from what people want in the NBA, what he's done, what his strengths and weaknesses are, I don't necessarily think it's a foregone conclusion, because one of the things would have been, can he step out and make shots? He hasn't really attempted many of those shots, but he hasn't made many of the ones that he has. I think the free throw shooting speaks to that. I know a lot of times that it is used as a proxy in some ways of, hey, if this guy can shoot free throws, I can get him to shoot from other places on the court. He's about the same that he was from the free throw line this year versus last, slightly worse, but 67.6% compared to 68.5. We'll call that a wash. 2-point shooting is a little bit worse on the whole, and rebounding numbers are fairly similar. Offensive rebounding rates down a bit. Blocks are still good. I think he's gotten better defensively. I thought last year there were times he just kind of went after blocks at the expense of maybe doing some other things. And so I think those things have improved. But like I said, I think when you look at the things that somebody would have said would hold him back in the NBA, I don't know that those are the things that have improved. And you mentioned the right hand. I have no doubt he's worked on it a lot, but I think when push comes to shove in games, it's still him having to really force stuff the other way and playing against physicality. I thought, Rutgers was an example. I think he was a microcosm of the team, so I don't put that all on him. Iowa, though, from a defensive standpoint, really lets you get comfortable and do the things that you want to do and gives you confidence. And Rutgers is out to take it away by being really physical. And he got his first couple shots blocked, and I thought that entered his mind a little bit at times in terms of the way he attacked Miles Johnson and some of those kinds of things. I think those are things that NBA people are going to look at as well. So I think that, I would agree with you. It's not a foregone conclusion that he would leave, and there are areas that he's gotten better in, but to me, not the ones that matter as much to NBA folks, at least.
Yeah. And I don't want anybody to misconstrue the fact that we're kind of talking about some of the things that he needs to get better at as a criticism of him as a player. He's a great college player. He deserves all the accolades he's getting. He's no doubt the most important part of Indiana's team. I'm just saying, when you have these conversations about guys going to the next level, there's a different criteria that has to be met and a different conversation of what's going to be looked at. And, I just don't necessarily see, as we get later here into the spring, maybe I'll try to talk to some scouts that I've talked to in the past, but I just don't, I guess the best way to put it is I don't understand necessarily the belief that it's certain that he's gone. It is kind of where I'm at with the whole thing.
Yeah, to me, we talk about Luka Garza, and they're totally different players. I'm not comparing them as players, but nobody has an issue with him saying, "Hey, this guy's a phenomenal college player,
but he's not a pro." He's probably going to get picked, but he's not going to be a...
Yeah, but what's he really going to be there? And his skill set is different than Trayce, but I think it's ultimately the same kind of thing of there's things that are part of the college game that you can do in the college game that just, whether they should be or shouldn't be, is up for debate, but they aren't valued by NBA teams. And I think, unfortunately for Trayce, some of the things that he does the best are not necessarily the things that are valued by those teams. And that's really what matters when it comes to that. But yeah, absolutely. From an IU perspective, they're a shell of what they were without a guy like him who's so important. And I think, again, that underscores itself in the Rutgers game. He doesn't play as well as he has in other games, and that ends up being the difference in a closer game. And we talked a lot about that on the post-game show of that's kind of the burden of being the star of the team, that you've got to carry a lot of weight every game. And if you have an off night, which everybody else gets the opportunity to do it from here and there and maybe not get criticized for it, I think that's part of being the star, and you're going to catch a little bit of the heat for that. And I think that's, I guess, the nature of his role on this team. But certainly you wouldn't look at a big game that they've won and say they would have been able to win it without his contributions to what you said earlier.
Yeah. When he doesn't play well, Indiana's has little margin for error. So I think that speaks
it's a steep uphill climb.
Right. So Andy, I'll get you out of here on this. I'm just kind of curious. Bracketology obviously is going to be something that you're going to be doing on a weekly basis. What are you, I guess, hoping to learn these next couple of weeks? Do you feel like we're going to hear it all from you mentioned that top 16 release that they've done in previous years? Do you think we're going to gain any insight as to what the selection criteria process is going to be. Do you talk to any other bracketologists or any? I know Coach Tonsoni does his bracketology group. I'm just kind of curious what maybe markers you're looking for here in the next couple weeks to be able to kind of continue to do your job as a bracketologist.
Yeah, it would be nice if they did that reveal. And like I said, I don't know that the top 16 would be maybe as telling, but there's a few teams that are in that mix that it might be. You might learn something in terms of how they're treated. Virginia might be one of those. They don't have a ton of quality wins. Their numbers are great, as they often are. And they're one that, if you look at other projections, there's a pretty wide range of where some folks have them. So they might be a team in that range that you might be able to gain some insight from. And it looked like, I haven't listened to it yet, but it seemed like Goodman had I think Dan Gavin and David Warlock on his podcast. So I'm kind of curious to listen to that. I think part of it sounded like, at least based on the outline that they put in their show notes, was around kind of what the committee was looking at and maybe how they deal with some of those things. So those are ultimately the kinds of little nuggets that I'm trying to find to figure out whether people are doing that. And Coach and I certainly talk about it, and I'm in contact with at least a few other folks where we discuss those things. But it'll be a different year for sure as far as that goes. But I think you're also starting to get teams in the middle of the conference season that maybe some of these teams that have been a little up and down, can they really start to, get their legs and you start to figure out what they really are. So I'll throw out a team like Clemson. They look really good at the beginning of the year. They go on pause. They haven't looked good since then. Over the next couple of weeks, do you figure out whether they're the team that's closer to what they look like at the beginning or closer to what they've been over the last couple of weeks? So it's largely stuff like that. And also just trying to watch and try to get some gauge on what these conferences are going to do about trying to reschedule these games that, like you said earlier, the Big Ten built this in and then haven't really used it a whole lot. Although at the same time, Penn State played 4 games in 7 days, not, last week. So they're trying to make up some of those games, but the clock is ticking. And I think it might've been Dylan that you had on last, was like, at some point you got to start moving some of these games forward to give yourself room on the back end. So I'm a little bit curious why they wouldn't try to do a little bit of that. And I think Archie Miller even brought it up on his radio show of like trying to figure out whether they're going to end up having a game in this interim window. So the time to sit and wait for some of these conferences, unless you got a really good plan that says, hey, I'm content not doing these, or I have a plan for our conference tournament, or all those things, the time to make some of these decisions is now. And I think for the most part, we've seen from a lot of leagues that you can sit back and think they might have a plan, but I'm not sure they have a plan. So we'll figure that out as we go, I guess.
For sure. Yeah. With the Big Ten, one thing I'm looking at is just see how they approach the conference tournament. I wouldn't totally be opposed to, and I'm sure the league would be totally opposed to this because of the money that the conference tournament generates from a TV perspective. But I wouldn't be opposed to just seeing, instead of a conference tournament, make up some of these regular season games and give teams kind of a chance to play their actual schedule. Because I look at the conference tournament and bringing all these teams together right before the tournament just is a little bit concerning for me in terms of getting to this point of the season, and then all of a sudden you bring all these groups together, maybe 2 or 3 of them get COVID and then can't play in the tournament, and it's like, what did they play the whole season for? So minimizing risk as much as possible to me is the way to go. But we'll see how it all plays out. And Andy, you'll be around every week on the assembly call talking about IU basketball. You'll have your bracketology on Inside the Hall. We always always look forward to waking up Tuesday morning, getting an email from you saying that it's in there, ready to edit. Looking forward to posting those, and hopefully Indiana will continue to stay on the right side of the bubble, because it'd be a lot more fun, I think, to continue to do our jobs, having to talk about a team that makes the tournament rather than one that doesn't, particularly in a year when every game is going to be played in the state of Indiana. So thanks again, Andy, for joining us, and we'll be back next week, everybody, with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.